Let me ask you something. If your relationship was a car, would it be cruising smoothly or are you running on fumes? Because here's the truth: most people don't crash their relationship with one big mistake. They slowly run it into the ground by ignoring the small check engine lights, and then they're shocked when the whole thing breaks down. Relationships don't collapse because of one fight, one missed date, or one harsh word. They collapse because we stop checking in, we stop asking the right questions, and we assume the other person is fine. Well, newsflash, fine usually means not fine, and if you don't create space for real conversations, resentment builds like plaque on your teeth, silent, slow, and dangerous. So here's the good news: you don't need a PhD in psychology to fix it. You just need to start asking 3 simple but powerful questions. These questions open the door to connection, clarity, and accountability, while questions revive them. Let's be honest, most of the conflict, frustration, and distance that creeps into relationships doesn't come from some big dramatic betrayal. It comes from one simple and dangerous habit: assuming. We assume we know what the other person is thinking. We assume we know why they did what they did. We assume they should just know what we need without us ever saying it out loud. The problem is assumptions create invisible walls, and over time, those walls become almost impossible to tear down. When you operate on assumptions, you're writing a script in your head for the other person without their permission. You decide what their motives are, you decide what they feel, and you decide what their silence or behavior must mean. And more often than not, those stories you tell yourself are wrong. Maybe your partner didn't call because they were slammed at work, but you assume they don't care anymore. Maybe your friend forgot to invite you somewhere, and instead of asking, you assume they're pulling away. Maybe your coworker was short with you in a meeting, and instead of checking in, you assume they don't respect you. The reality is, most of the time people's actions are about them, not about you. But if you don't ask, if you don't clarify, your assumptions take root, and once they take root, they can poison how you see that person. Now, here's why assumptions are so deadly: they shut down curiosity. Curiosity is what keeps relationships alive. It's what makes you lean in instead of pull back. But the second you assume, you stop being curious. You think you already know the answer, and from that point on, you're not engaging with the real person, you're engaging with a version of them you created in your head, and that's not fair to them, and it's not fair to you. This is where questions come in. Questions revive relationships because they bring you back into reality instead of letting you stay stuck in your imagination. When you ask instead of assume, you're saying, I value your perspective more than the story I'm making up. You're giving the other person the gift of being heard and the opportunity to correct misunderstandings before they become resentment. Think about how powerful that is. One simple question can dissolve weeks of tension. One conversation can save years of distance. Let's say you feel like your partner is withdrawing from you. You could assume they've lost interest, and your behavior will start to match that story. You'll pull away too, or you'll get resentful. But what if instead you asked, hey, I've noticed you seem distracted lately. Is something going on? Suddenly, instead of 2 people drifting apart, you've opened a bridge of communication. Maybe they're stressed about work. Maybe they're worried about something else entirely. Or maybe they are feeling distance, but now you've created a safe space to address it. Questions are powerful because they put you in problem-solving mode instead of blame mode. They allow you to check your interpretations before you act on them. Imagine how many arguments could be avoided if people stopped assuming and simply asked for clarification. Instead of, you didn't text me back, so you must not care, it becomes, hey, I noticed you didn't respond, everything okay? One of those statements accuses, the other connects. Here's the kicker: assumptions are easy, questions take courage. It's easier to stay in your head and decide what something means than it is to look someone in the eye and ask them directly. But easy isn't what builds strong relationships. If you want connection, you've got to trade comfort for courage. You've got to be willing to put your ego aside long enough to admit, I don't actually know what's going on, so let me ask. That's not weakness, that's maturity. The truth is, people who make assumptions end up walking around with relationship stories that aren't even true. They're carrying around imaginary offenses, imaginary insults, imaginary neglect, and those things weigh them down. But people who ask questions live lighter. They deal in reality, not in fiction. And because they deal in reality, their relationships are stronger, healthier, and more resilient. So if you want to improve your relationships in a meaningful way, stop assuming you know and start asking so you can know. Replace the inner dialogue of they must be thinking with the actual question, what are you thinking? Replace they don't care with what do you need from me right now? Replace they don't appreciate me with what's one thing I could do that would make you feel more valued. Questions breathe life into connection because they put truth on the table. And truth is what relationships are built on. If you really care about the people in your life, don't settle for living in assumptions. Ask the question, clear the air, and choose clarity over confusion. That's how you stop letting your relationships rot from the inside out. That's how you revive them. People feel valued when you ask how to love them better. It sounds obvious until you realize how rarely it actually happens. Most of us operate under the assumption that our way of showing care is universal. We think gifts equal love, or quality time equals proof, or advice equals support. Problem is, people receive love differently. You may be pouring gasoline on a fire while the person beside you is asking for water. Asking, plainly, directly, without drama, what would make you feel more valued, does two critical things at once. It communicates respect and it clarifies action. Respect because you're admitting you don't have all the answers. Clarification because you're turning vague intent into concrete behaviors. That combination is fierce in relationships. When you ask, you stop performing for applause and start serving the person right in front of you. Imagine your partner shrugging off dinners and cozy evenings because what they need is validation after a hard day. Meanwhile, you keep cooking elaborate meals thinking you're winning. The meals are lovely, but the gap remains because you never asked. The simplest question closes that gap. How can I show up for you tonight is not theatrical, it's practical. When someone hears, I want to know what makes you feel seen, their nervous system relaxes a little. They stop guessing about your intentions and start trusting that you actually want to meet them where they are. Asking also demonstrates humility. People instinctively value humility because it signals emotional safety. If you say, tell me what would make you feel valued, you're saying, I am more interested in your experience than in being right. That disarms defensiveness and opens honesty. The other person no longer has to translate your gestures into meaning. They can simply name what matters. This is crucial after hurt because wounded people often don't want reparations so much as cues that you understand what injured them. A sincere question invites that cue. Another practical benefit is you eliminate wasted effort. Time, energy, and emotional labor are finite. Why gamble on being effective when you can be intentional? Asking refocuses effort into actions that land. If your friend needs a listening ear rather than solutions, asking saves both of you from escalation. If your partner needs you to pick up the kids on Thursdays, asking saves resentment. The efficiency of targeted care is underrated. People feel valued not because someone tried, but because the attempt matched the need. There's also an element of dignity in being asked. When someone asks how to love you better, they're elevating your preferences to the level of data that deserves weighting. Instead of being passive recipients of whatever is offered, people become active participants in how they're loved. That matters. Human beings are wired for agency. Giving someone the power to say, this is what helps me, restores agency and reinforces worth. Asking is not a magic spell. It requires follow through. If you ask and then ignore the answer, you've done worse than never asking. You've created a measurable breach of trust. The pattern that destroys credibility is asking for guidance and then returning to old habits because change is uncomfortable. So the point is not to ask one time and feel morally absolved. The point is to create a habit, routine check-ins. Is this working? Or did that help keep you accountable? Value is confirmed when behavior changes over time, not with a single proclamation. There are practical ways to make asking effective. Use specific, simple language. What's one thing I can do this week that would make you feel more appreciated? Ask with curiosity, not with a defensive edge. Take notes mentally or literally. Try the answer, then report back. I try. How did that land? That follow-up closes the loop and models the behavior you want to normalize iterative care. Finally, consider the cumulative effect. One asked and acted upon preference is worth more than 100 well-intentioned but misaligned gestures. Over weeks and months, these small aligned behaviors compound into trust, intimacy, and safety. That's the difference between two people coexisting and two people building a life together. If you want to be someone who strengthens relationships, start by making asking a habit. It's the shortest, most direct route to making the people you care about feel seen, heard, and valued. So stop guessing, start asking, improve your love with actions that actually matter. The payoff is huge, deeper connection, fewer fights, and a relationship that truly thrives. Do it now. The third key point is that small annoyances only grow when left unspoken. This truth is one of the silent killers of relationships because it operates under the radar until it finally explodes. Most people don't end relationships over one massive argument or betrayal. They end them because of the 1,000 tiny cuts that were never addressed. Every time you brush something off, every time you swallow a frustration instead of voicing it, you're not keeping the peace. You're planting seeds of resentment. And here's the thing about resentment, it never stays small. It grows, it festers, it mutates. A minor irritation today becomes a full-blown deal breaker tomorrow if you don't deal with it. Take something as simple as dishes in the sink. On day one, you roll your eyes and wash them yourself. On day two, you sigh a little louder when you notice it again. By day 30, you're not just annoyed about the dishes, you've written a whole narrative about how your partner doesn't respect you, doesn't appreciate you, or doesn't value your effort. What started as a spoon in the sink turned into a story about your worth. That's how small annoyances grow into major relational problems. And the tragedy is, it could have been solved with one honest conversation early on. Hey, It would mean a lot to me if you could rinse your dishes. It makes me feel like we're sharing the load. Simple, direct, and preventative. Why do people avoid voicing small annoyances? Because they tell themselves it's not a big deal. They convince themselves it's better to keep quiet than to stir up conflict. They fear being labeled as nitpicky or difficult. But silence doesn't erase the annoyance, it buries it. And buried annoyances have a way of resurfacing at the worst possible times, often in the middle of an unrelated argument. That's why you'll see couples fighting about something trivial while clearly carrying the weight of years of unspoken frustrations. They're not fighting about the toothpaste cap or the thermostat. They're fighting about what those things represent: ignored needs, dismissed feelings, and patterns that were never confronted. Here's the hard truth: avoiding discomfort in the moment guarantees a bigger explosion later. If you think you're keeping the peace by staying silent, you're not. You're just pushing the conflict into the future where it will be louder, harder, and messier. Speaking up doesn't mean starting a war. It means addressing something while it's still small enough to handle calmly. Think about it like weeds in a garden. Pull them when they're tiny and it takes a few seconds. Let them grow and they choke out everything else, leaving you with a mess that's exhausting to clean up. Addressing annoyances early requires courage and emotional discipline. You have to catch yourself before you let irritation harden into resentment. That means being aware of your own reactions and recognizing when something keeps bothering you. If you notice yourself replaying a behavior in your head or telling the same complaint to your friends, that's a signal you need to bring it up with the person directly. And here's where skill comes in: how you bring it up matters. If you turn it into an attack, you never care about what I want, the other person will get defensive. If you frame it as an invitation to improve the relationship, it would help me if you did X. You create space for problem solving instead of blame. Another reason people avoid voicing annoyances is because they underestimate how much the other person is willing to adjust. Most of the time, people don't even realize their behavior is bothering you. What takes up space in your head may not even be on their radar. Giving them feedback is actually giving them a chance to show up better. You're not being difficult, you're giving them the gift of clarity. And clarity is the lifeblood of healthy relationships. Of course, not every annoyance is worth voicing. The skill is in discerning what actually matters to you versus what you can genuinely let go of. But here's the filter: if it's something you keep thinking about or something that makes you feel less respected, valued, or cared for, then it's not small anymore. It's significant and it needs to be named. Pretending you're unbothered doesn't make you strong, it just makes you silently frustrated. True strength is being able to communicate honestly without hostility. Think about how much healthier relationships would be if people addressed things in real time instead of storing them up like ammunition. Instead of unleashing years of bitterness in one brutal fight, you'd have dozens of small, manageable conversations along the way. That's how relationships thrive, not by avoiding conflict, but by mastering it at the smallest level. It's not the big storms that usually sink a relationship. It's the steady leak that no one bothered to fix. So the lesson is this: don't wait until you're drowning in frustration to speak up. Don't trick yourself into thinking silence is kindness. The kindest thing you can do for any relationship is to clear the air early and often. When you keep small annoyances unspoken, you're choosing long-term damage over short-term discomfort. When you voice them respectfully, you're choosing growth, understanding, and connection. And that's how you keep a relationship alive, strong, and worth holding on to. The fourth key point is that consistent check-ins are the difference between drifting apart and growing closer. Relationships aren't static. They're living, breathing things that either evolve or erode depending on how they're maintained. The danger is that many people assume that once a bond is strong, it will stay strong on its own. That's like buying a car and never changing the oil. You might get by for a while, but sooner or later the neglect catches up with you. The truth is, relationships don't fall apart overnight. They unravel gradually through silence, neglect, and missed opportunities to reconnect. Consistent check-ins are the antidote to that drift. They're the habit that keeps you aligned, keeps you growing, and keeps you from waking up one day next to a stranger. A check-in doesn't have to be complicated. It's simply the intentional act of pausing and asking, how are we doing? Or is there something we need to talk about? The reason this matters so much is because people change. Their needs change, their stress levels change, their expectations shift with life. What worked 6 months ago may not work today. If you never check in, you're operating on outdated information. It's like using last year's map to drive through a city that's been completely rebuilt. You're going to get lost. When you check in, you're updating the map. You're making sure you know where the other person stands, what they need, and how they're experiencing the relationship. Check-ins also prevent little misunderstandings from becoming massive resentments. Left unchecked, frustrations stack up quietly until they tip over into explosive conflict. But if you've built the habit of checking in regularly, issues get surfaced early while they're still manageable. Think of it like cleaning your house. If you do it every week, it's a quick task. Skip it for 6 months and suddenly it's overwhelming. Relationships work the same way. Small, consistent maintenance prevents big, painful blow-ups. Another power of consistent check-ins is that they create a culture of safety. When someone knows they have a regular space to voice concerns, they're less likely to bottle things up. They don't have to wait until they're boiling over because they trust there will be an opportunity to be heard. That kind of safety builds intimacy because people relax when they know communication is expected and welcome. Instead of fearing that their feelings will be dismissed or spark a fight, they feel reassured that honesty is part of the process. Check-ins also keep relationships intentional. It's easy to slip into autopilot where you're physically together but emotionally disconnected. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, and before you know it, the relationship feels flat. A check-in interrupts the drift by pulling you both back into awareness. It forces you to ask, are we still aligned? Are we still working toward the same goals? Do we still feel connected? Those questions aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of commitment. They prove you care enough to steer the relationship rather than let it wander. Some people avoid check-ins because they fear what might come up. They think if I ask, I might hear something I don't want to hear. But that fear is misplaced. The truth is, the issue is already there whether you talk about it or not. Avoiding the conversation doesn't protect the relationship. It just guarantees that problems will grow unchecked. If something is wrong, wouldn't you rather know now when it can be addressed than later when it's too late? Consistent check-ins are like turning the lights on in a dark room. You might see some mess, but at least now you can clean it up. The format of a check-in can be as simple as asking 3 questions. What's going well for us? What's been hard? And what can we do better? Those 3 open-ended prompts cover appreciation, challenges, and improvement. They set the stage for constructive, balanced conversations instead of criticism sessions. And the frequency matters less than the consistency. Maybe it's once a week over coffee or once a month on a walk. What matters is that it happens regularly enough to catch changes early and keep the bond strong. When couples, friends, or even coworkers commit to check in, something powerful happens. They grow closer not just because problems are solved, but because appreciation is voiced. Too often, people only communicate when something is wrong. But check-ins create space to say what's right, too. I really appreciated how you supported me this week. I've noticed you've been more patient lately. Hearing that feedback strengthens trust and reinforces positive behaviors. Growth isn't only about fixing weaknesses, it's also about celebrating strengths. The difference between drifting apart and growing closer really does come down to whether or not you create intentional touch points. Neglect leaves room for distance to creep in. Consistent communication keeps the connection alive. Relationships require attention, not in grand, occasional gestures, but in steady, consistent effort. Just like a garden, you don't water it once and expect it to bloom forever. You water it regularly, and that's what keeps it thriving. So if you want a relationship that lasts, stop relying on luck or chemistry alone. Start building the discipline of consistent check-ins. They may feel small in the moment, but they add up to something massive: trust, clarity, intimacy, and resilience. They are the difference between looking back one day and saying, we grew together, versus we just drifted apart. The choice is yours, and it starts with the simple act of asking, how are we doing?